Hi everyone, it's Professor Hall. It's week 5 and we are focusing on dialogue. So, our stories for the week: Big Blonde by Dorothy Parker, The Learning Hydra by Agatha Christie. I almost said by Hercule Poirot. It's by Agatha Christie featuring Hercule Poirot. And our instructive text, which I will talk about in a minute. But our sample comes from a book called Spectrum, a young adult science fiction novel. So let's jump into The Learning Hydra by Agatha Christie. I picked this in part because some of her stories have been made into films featuring Hercule Poirot, but really, we have this detective, and it isn't as much that Agatha Christie is particularly masterful with dialogue. What I find interesting in this story is that the solution to the mystery is based on almost entirely, on dialogue. And that this is a complaint that people had about the Hercule Poirot movie, about the train. Now I'm blanking on the name of it. Murder on the Orient Express. I had to look it up on my phone and pause the recording. It's been a long day. Some issues that people have with Murder on the Orient Express is that it is different than a lot of other murder mysteries, and people complained that there was a lot of talking and not as much action. But here's the thing: when you have a classic detective story, detectives are working with different things, meaning that Sherlock Holmes looks for clues. He'll look at a ash and he'll say, oh, that comes from a particular cigarette. Miss Marple, another Agatha Christie creation, she works with types of people she's seen before. So someone who is about to murder someone reminds her of someone in a village who was perhaps not nice to their spouse. But Hercule Poirot, he always says that he's basing his decisions on psychology. And how does he learn about the psychology of the suspects in this murder case? He learns about them through what they say. So we get a lot of characterization through the dialogue. And it is really him talking to a series of suspects. And we as the reader are drawn into this, hopefully. And we look at suspect number 1, what they say, what they do, what we know about them, how they say things. We have Dr. Oldfield, whose wife has died. We have a little bit of description about him, but it's really the way that he says things. So there are rumors that he has poisoned his wife, and Hercule Poirot says, aha, did you poison her? Mr. Poirot! Dr. Oldfield springs to his feet. Calm yourself, sit down again. We will take it then that you did not poison your wife. Okay, so it's even in just the Mr. Poirot, and he stands up. Those descriptions there of Dr. Oldfield sprang to his feet. That's a dialogue tag, but it's done with action. And so that's something that I'd like you to note as well. There's a mixture here of the dialogue tags said, shouted, screamed, but there's also some action put in there to show what these people are doing while they're talking. So that becomes kind of important. Now, the other thing is that we have a couple women. The way that they talk, we have one girl, Jean, or a woman named Jean, and she is quite blunt in the way that she talks. And we have another character who's a little bit older, and they're describing things in kind of these flowery terms. We also have a little bit of stereotyping with some maids who are presumably Irish in this story based on the time period and the location of being in the UK. I believe that they're Irish. And then we have Miss Leatherin, the old town gossip, who says, well, of course, there's been a lot of talk, but of course, I don't listen to it, but of course. In today's time, we'd be like, she's kind of a Karen. Sorry to my mother, who's also named Karen, who's not a Karen in that sense. But yeah, so this repetition of a verbal tick of the use of course, over and over and over again is something that is quite interesting. The bluntness of one character, the hesitation of another, the flowery kind of descriptiveness of yet another, the way that the servants talk. Hercule Poirot has a servant who he thinks very highly of, but who's very formal and stilted, and so you see the different styles. And one of the things that I'll talk about in the instructive text in a minute is that the problem with the original version of that was that many of the characters sounded the same. Here, she has taken great pains to really make them all sound different based on their age, their gender, their social station, so their class in that way, their occupations even kind of come into it a little bit. And the solution to the story is really based on what someone said to him and the way that they said it. So their point of view being inconsistent with what he knows about the psychology of the characters. So for that reason, I think it's quite interesting. Then we have Big Blonde by Dorothy Parker. I almost used this story for characterization, but I decided to put it here instead. The reason is that this is a story from the 1920s. Dorothy Parker was kind of a satirical writer, so she's got a lot of humor in here in the way that she's describing these characters and what they're doing. It's also, she was a modernist writer, so she's writing during the roaring 1920s. And we have this woman, Hazel, who is, she's there for kind of a good time. And they talk about what she was like in her 20s, what she's like now, how she's kind of described like being a bimbo in a way. But the dialogue, there's two things about the dialogue. One is that I think it's quite authentic in the way that it does sound, the way that people would talk. The problem is that it sounds the way that people would talk in the 1920s. So I'd like you to kind of think about that as you read it, reading it almost 100 years later. What were people like back then? What kind of slang are they using? How are they describing things? So here's a little excerpt. Her habitual greeting to him was an allusion to his state of the previous night, meaning that he was drinking. "Oh, what a peach you had," she used to say through her easy laugh. "I thought I'd die the way you kept asking the waiter to dance with you." She liked him immediately upon their meeting. She was enormously amused at his fast, slurred sentences and his interpolation of apt phrases from vaudeville acts and comic strips. So this is what these people are talking like. They're using slang from these speakeasies, and we have... here, then later on in their relationship, they kind of get into an argument, and here's what he says. "Ah, for God's sake," he would say, "crabbing again. All right, sit there and crab your head off. Crab, crab, crab. I'm going out." He'd slam out of the flat and come back late and drunk. She was completely bewildered. And so we have... it's not a story that's completely dialogue, the way the Learning Hydra is really a lot of dialogue with some action in between. We have some things that people say about her. We have the relationship between Herb and Hazel going on, and the way that they talk to each other at first, the way that they talk to each other later, how Herbie is getting with money, how they react when they're drunk in particular. And so... those are some things that I'd like you to look for. How does the dialogue between these two people show the state of their relationship? And how does it really... some of the characterization is just the narrator telling you about these characters, but a lot of the characterization is taking place through the dialogue. And we learn about them through the things that they say, as much as the things that they do. But there are, you had a real peach last night, and gee, I feel sorry for horses. um, there are I mean, there is a horse in that scene, but the golly gee and sunk me eye, he said. What's the idea of all that belly aching? What have you got to be sunk about? I can't help it, me eye. Pull yourself together, will ya? So yeah, there's these slang phrases, and you can have those in a book. But what you don't, if you watch a period piece, like if you watch a movie that's set in like the 60s or 70s, and everybody's like, oh man, that was so groovy, and then you watch something like Stranger Things, they're like, awesome, radical dude, right? Like something like that. I don't think they say that in Stranger Things, but they do in Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which was made in the 80s. Those kind of slang phrases really do date the text. And so I think it's interesting to look at it from that point of view. So you can read one, you can read the other, you can read both, but I hope that you kind of see some things about dialogue and how to use it to show characterization, how to use it to increase tension and have it be part of that plot, and how to mix those dialogue tags. So sometimes said or yelled or shouted is good, and sometimes you don't want to have that verb and you just want to have the character doing something. So how about our instructive text? Well, Spectrum is a young adult science fiction novel. And in the first version of Spectrum, it was written by an author who I worked with, who was quite young at the time that she wrote this book. And now that I'm thinking of it, this is actually her second book. So her first book was Latium, and I think she wrote that when she was 18. This book she wrote when she was 19 or 20. And she's a great writer, but the first version of this book, the problem was that we have multiple first-person narration. So it goes between Aaron and Lydia. Chapter 1 is Aaron, Chapter 2 is Lydia, Chapter 3 is Aaron, Chapter 4 is Lydia. So we go back and forth between these two characters, which was great. The problem was that Aaron and Lydia are both teenagers, and they're both kind of snarky, sullen teenagers fighting against the system. And that's okay. But what was not okay was that many of the other characters also sounded like snarky teenagers. And so what we had is Sebastian, who is Lydia's father. We have Theo, who is Aaron's brother. We have later on Aaron's father, who's not in this excerpt, but we have Aaron's father. And Aaron, his father, and his brother all sounded like they were kind of bratty 15-year-olds. And so what I talked to her about was that the dialogue needed to be changed because the descriptions of these characters, the narration, the other ways that we were getting the characterization, right? The things that people said about them, the things that their appearances, what they did, what they said, how they acted, what they felt, all of that was really in contrast to the dialogue. So the Aaron's brother, Theo, is supposed to be in his mid to upper 20s, and he's working for his father. They're in a war, and he's on his father's side in the war. Aaron is 16 or 17, and he is rebelling against his father, and in essence against his older brother as well. But Theo, being like 25 and about 10 years older than his brother, still sounded like he was 15. And he didn't sound like he was a company guy who towed the line. And he was also supposed to be, as the antagonist or one of the antagonists in the story, he was really supposed to be threatening and menacing. And so you have him saying things like, I'm scanning up so I can read you a little bit. Okay, so Theo, I choked. In the flesh, little brother, Theo leered at me. That's not like scary, really, right? And then he says some other things. Come on, you're not even gonna look at me. I've been standing here long enough. You know better than to talk to that guy, the enemy. Um, Come on, Dad wants to see you. You coming? There was just not the for lack of a better term, the gravitas there for him to say some of those things. So instead, we have this. Theo, I choked, locking eyes with the man outside my cell. You know better than to talk to the enemy, Theo said. He leered at me through the bars. It'd been years, but he looked exactly the same. Angular face, dark eyes, close-cropped hair, my father's favorite son. So there's little things that were changed here, but in terms of dialogue and some of the descriptions as well. But the dialogue was changed to be a little bit more consistent with the character. So he doesn't come in joking. He comes in with a gun and says, you know better than to talk to the enemy. Get out of the cell. Let's go. Pulls him out. As opposed to, hey, Dad wants to see you. You coming? Which, like, Dad wants to see you, possibly to torture you and possibly to murder you because he's the bad guy, right? So a few other things here. There are some dialogue tags missing, which you can do if two people are talking, but at a certain point, I think Aaron is talking to someone named Sebastian. At a certain point, as you're reading, you're like, wait, who's talking here? Is it Aaron or is it Sebastian? It's kind of confusing. So that's something to kind of see as well. One of the things that she does really well is mixing in that action. So it's not, I think the first version has a little more like, he says this, it's more like dialogue. The second version is broken up a tiny bit. So somebody says something and then there's a little bit of action and then there's more dialogue and we have talk, and then a little paragraph of action and then talk. So that in terms of pacing, it works a lot better. So yeah, take a look at that, and I hope I've given you enough details that you kind of know what to look for, but I hope that you learn from that, that, you know, when you're rewriting dialogue, it's kind of like what I said the other week. Sometimes small changes can make big impacts. And I think it's really clear that it's not too much that changed. It's still the same scene, but with those small changes of dialogue, with those small changes of description, with breaking up the dialogue so that it's not just two talking heads on a page and there's actually stuff going on that the reader can kind of care about. All of that. So I hope you enjoy the text for this week, and I can't wait to see your thoughts in the discussion forum. Thanks.